Altruism comes to us from the Latin alter, meaning other. So altruists, without borders, would be people who are other-directed, without barriers. And I want to speak to you tonight about 5 different barriers or borders that Fethullah Gulen and people of Hizmet can help us to overcome. 5 different kinds of altruism, if you will. The first is the altruism of learning, beyond the border of nature and nurture, or beyond the warfare between science and religion. The second is the altruism of devotion, beyond the border of the material and the spiritual. The third is the altruism of empathy, beyond the border of emotion versus reason. The fourth is the altruism of principled pluralism, beyond the border of us versus them. And finally, I'll say a few words about the altruism of social enterprise, beyond the border of capitalism versus socialism. And I'll conclude with what I hope will be a word of hope. And I'll be weaving together some meditations along with reading a few passages from the book. But I believe in our polarized time, it's healthy and holy for people to be able to laugh together as well. Now, I'm a person of German and Norwegian descent, and Germans and Norwegians are not notably known for their senses of humor. So please bear with me on this one, if you will. My rationale for this attempt, and I stress the word attempt, to get us to laugh together actually comes from a 14th century woman by the name of Julian of Norwich. I see some heads nodding in the room, who struggled to work with people who were facing the plague in England at the time. And she said, the way to fight evil is not to cudgel the brain, but to live a life of love and laughter. So, how many of you know what a knock-knock joke is? Okay, good. You're with me then. You can help me out on this because I definitely need your help on this as well. So, knock knock.
Who's there?
Ash.
Ash.
Bless you, my friends. Good. All right, a couple chuckles anyway. Second one. Knock knock.
Who's there?
Tank.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And one more. Knock knock.
Who's there?
Olive. I love you too. And that's known as a transition. Because the very foundation of the life of Fethullah Gulen and the global Hizmet movement he has inspired is this notion of love as the very essence of who we are as people. Both love for God and love for neighbor. And this starts with his upbringing. He was born in 1938 in a small village, a very tiny village in northeastern Turkey, Korajuk. Maybe 50 homes in this rural farming village. But he had a very happy family. And out of that family, he learned from his father, Ramiz, who was an imam, and his mother, Rafia, who was his first Quran teacher, the meaning of love. And although at the time, secular Turkey did not encourage learning in Islam, Mr. Gulen, as a child, would sit with the scholars who would come through Korajuk to visit his home. And left home fairly early, at the age of 13 or 14. Only went to public school until the second grade. Left home fairly early for madrasa education in Erzurum, the largest city nearby. But early on, he discovered that the education he was receiving in the madrasa had some shortcomings. And I want to read to you just a brief passage about what he said. Now, this is in retrospect, but about his upbringing and education in the madrasa. And it leads us toward recognizing the altruism of learning and how, throughout his life and work, he has sought to overcome the warfare between science and religion, moving beyond the border between the natural world and the spiritual world. Here's what he said. We were offered lots of things in the madrasa. Perhaps they were useful in terms of providing materials for dialectical reasoning, but not to construct a modern line of thought. I early noticed that the madrasa did not have a modern line of rationale, a mathematical foundation, or at least a root in Baconian logic. The result, he goes on, was that the madrasa estranged the natural sciences and research, despite injunctions in the Quran and the Sunnah, while God says, we will show them our manifest signs in the horizons of the universe and within their own selves. We hardly saw research, examination, and engagements with the nature of things. Although the Quran was read, the book of nature was left to the side. A clash emerged in the society, and the mind separated from the heart. Consequently, the book of the universe was put in one place, and the book of the Quran was put in the other. End quote. So throughout his life, starting very early in recognizing the shortcomings of the education he had received in Islam, that was not faithful to Islam itself, he has encouraged people to study the book of God, the revelation of God in nature. And so as a result, many people of Hizmet around the globe have studied genetics, biology, chemistry, engineering, and the sciences as an expression of their life of faith, overcoming the border between religion and science, and encouraging the altruism of learning in all aspects of life, including the other of the natural world, the personhood, if you will, of the natural world. Second, the altruism of devotion, beyond the border of the material. We often don't think of prayer and the other practices of devotion as acts that also have material significance. And yet it's occurred to Mr. Gulen and to others that when we pray, we are also changing our brains and we are changing the society around us. The fact of the matter is our brains change slowly over the course of evolution from their natural tendencies, animal tendencies of fight or flight. And it is through practices such as prayer, or pilgrimage, or fasting during Ramadan, or the practice of zakat in charity, or simply saying one of the 99 beautiful names of God, that we learn to be more sociable, and our brains take on the capacity to recognize others through devotion. Mr. Gulen studied with Sufi masters, notably the Imam of a tiny village called Alvar, the Imam of Alvar, but studied many of the Sufi masters. And here is how Mr. Gulen describes, quoting a 14th century Azerbaijani Sufi poet, what happens during prayer? The space where I am has developed into no space. This body of mine has wholly become a soul. God's look has manifested itself to me, and I have seen myself intoxicated with God's meeting. A call has come to me from the ultimate truth. Come, O lover, you are intimate with us. This is the station of intimacy. I have found you a faithful one. Such language of being a lover of God and intoxicated with meeting God has often made some literalists across traditions uneasy. And yet, For Gulen and for people of Hizmet, this is the power of prayer. Intimacy with God translates into service to humanity beyond the border of the material and the spiritual. Third, the altruism of empathy. One of the things that's most significant about Mr. Gulen in his life and practice is that he cries. In fact, he became known in Turkey as the crying Hoca, or the crying teacher. And when I first became aware of this and watched the videos of his sermons in the 1960s and 70s, especially in Izmir and Istanbul, eventually he preached in the largest mosques in Turkey, and people flocked to hear him preach. And he would sob. He would break down sobbing as he was telling the stories about Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the companions of the Prophet, and their struggles to establish Islam, this religion of peace, over and against the opposition that they encountered early on. And I thought, what's going on here? Why is he crying? Many other people have asked that question, of course, and one of the answers that Mr. Gulen gives to this is, well, I guess God just made me that way. But more substantively, he goes on to describe, and I'm going to read you a little bit from the book, describe how he became aware through his prayer and through his practice of the suffering of humanity. So, deep feeling with the suffering of Muslims and others around the world. And here's how I describe it in the book. God wanted people in very different ways, these are Mr. Gulen's words, first to realize and then be saved from the troubled state that they are really in. For instance, Gulen went on, adapting Plato. If a man at the bottom of a well or a dungeon is aware of his situation and feels due suffering, that person will try to get out in many different ways and will achieve that goal in the end by God's grace. Even if that one does not possess any tools, they'll try to climb out by using hands like claws. You strive on and make 2 small holes where he can insert his feet. After managing to stand on them, he does the same above the first ones. Continuing like this, he makes his way out of the well after a certain period of time. But a person living contentedly down there, even unaware of his situation, will never make such an effort. End quote. So Gulen's tears, I go on, were to awaken other Muslims to their collective suffering, and then to inspire them to claw their way out, step by patient step. The lesson, of course, was hardly limited only to Muslims. The Buddha taught, after all, that the first noble truth was this simple assertion: life is suffering. But if Gulen had stopped there would have been no Hizmet movement, just as if the Buddha had not taught a way out of suffering, there would have been no Buddhism. Turning suffering into engaged purpose in the world was the challenge. It was young people who were among Gulen's first circle. He was a mosque teacher in Izmir, Kastana Pazar Mosque School. And Izmir is a very cosmopolitan city on the Aegean. How many have been there? All right, a couple. Anyway, beautiful place. Probably my favorite city in Turkey. But lots of colleges and universities. And as Mr. Gulen's reputation began to expand, and as people wondered, what's going on with this crying Hoja, young people were drawn to him. And he didn't just preach emotion, he also helped people see a way out of suffering by engaging in service. Following from the teachings of Said Nursi, a mid-20th century Turkish Kurdish reformer, actually, who spent a lot of time in prison in Turkey, Mr. Gulen taught that there were three problems facing the modern world. The first is ignorance. And what's the solution to ignorance? Education, learning. So people inspired by Mr. Gulen began to build schools. And not mosque schools, but math and science academies. So that by 2015, there were schools in 100 different countries built by people of Hizmet inspired by Mr. Gulen. So ignorance is the first problem, solved by education, and people address the problem of suffering by building schools. Second problem Mr. Gulen identified is poverty. Produces untold suffering around the globe. What's the solution to the problem of poverty?
Sharing.
Sharing, work, wealth generation, exactly. And so Mr. Gulen encouraged and inspired people to develop social businesses. And this is across the range of the capacity of human enterprise. So not only schools, but also they built the buildings that the schools would go in. They would develop the roads that would go to the schools. They would set up the IT infrastructure that would support the schools. And he began encouraging people to develop media enterprises. So newspapers, television stations, radio stations, right? All of them serving to generate revenue, to lift people out of poverty, and to share the resources then in relationship to the educational enterprises as well, and what the economist Robert Reich describes as a virtuous cycle. All right, the third problem then, that Mr. Gulen, following Said Nursi, sought to engage people was, the third problem facing the modern world was disunity or violence. What's the solution to the problem of disunity or violence?
Unity and love.
Unity and love, yes, at core, sure. And putting that into practice in a practical way means gathering people together like we are experiencing tonight to overcome the silos and the identities that divide us as well. So the Crying Hoja not only help people identify with their suffering and with the suffering of the world, but also engaged them, and I call this engaged empathy. It's the core of the Hizmet movement. Fourth, the altruism of principled pluralism. So often, interfaith work has suffered from a reduction to the lowest common denominator phenomenon. Right? In other words, you have to leave your distinctiveness at the door when you come into a community of conversation or a dialogue. Mr. Gulen encouraged something different. The Turkish word here is hoşgörü. Hoşgörü. It's a combination of two terms, actually, which means to see nicely. So when we enter into a dialogue, it's not that we leave ourselves behind, it's that we enter with a different attitude or approach. And so hoşgörü usually gets translated from the Turkish as tolerance. But it's not nearly a strong enough interpretation or translation of the term. And yet Mr. Gulen is known very much as a teacher of tolerance in Turkey, because he began organizing, he and people inspired by him began organizing massive interfaith iftar dinners held in Istanbul. The first one was in 1995 at the Renaissance Polat Hotel. 1,000 people, atheists, secularists, communists, Jews, Christians of all stripes, including Armenians, and Muslims of various stripes as well, gathered together for hoşgörü, for tolerance. And Mr. Gulen was the keynote speaker, and this was the theme of his talk. And hoşgörü is not, again, just tolerance or to see nicely, to push it even more deeply to the theological ground out of which Mr. Gulen is always teaching and practicing. Hoshkaru means to see another as God sees them. And God sees with eyes of mercy and compassion above all. Bismillah, al-Rahman, al-Rahim, Muslims say. In the name of God, the merciful and the compassionate. So out of this altruism of principled pluralism, knowing who he was and practicing with integrity as a Muslim, he was able to reach out to anyone and everyone. And people identified with Mr. Gulen, inspired by Mr. Gulen, could also reach out to anyone. And you see examples of this here in Canberra in our gathering tonight. A vivid demonstration of precisely this altruism of principled pluralism, beyond the border of us versus them. And finally, the altruism of social enterprise, beyond the border of capitalism and socialism. Throughout these businesses that were started, the schools, the think tanks, the media enterprises, and all of the rest, there was one principle that undergirded them. The term is istishara, and it means mutual consultation. And at the core of this mutual consultation is an organic way of being together that's very much like what Muhammad Yunus has described, the Nobel laureate in economics, as social businesses. That is, recognizing an opportunity and recognizing a need and a problem, and then marshaling together the resources to address that particular need. So this practice of istishara led to the formation of foundations and gatherings of trustees, boards of directors, in other words, an organizational structure in every country where people of Hizmet landed, right, that then adapted itself to the local circumstances, following the rule of law in the particular culture, and yet applying this difference beyond capitalism, beyond socialism, truly in a third way of social business or social enterprise. Now, as Muhammad mentioned, Mr. Gulen and people of Hizmet have faced severe persecution in Turkey in recent years. But for Mr. Gulen, this is actually nothing new. Throughout his life, he has faced political opposition, because he has been framed as a politician when he has never endorsed a political party, has never endorsed a political candidate. He's a spiritual leader and an individual of prayer whose teachings have had political implications, to be sure, but it's not about politics for him. All right? And initially, he was scapegoated by the secularist left because he was an outspoken Muslim and because people were drawn to him. His sermons would get recorded on cassette tapes and circulated, throughout Turkey, and people would show up in busloads to hear him preach. So there was, a lot of energy associated with him in this movement of Hizmet, this movement of service beyond the border of capitalism and socialism. And so he was targeted by the secular left, and whenever there was a military coup in Turkey, which there has been, unfortunately, a repeated pattern of, he would be arrested, detained, or threatened with arrest, and would have to go on the run. Between 1980 and 1986, he was on the run throughout Turkey. And yet what's interesting about this persecution is that every time the state, initially, the secular state, now the political Islamist state, the AKP party, would press down on Mr. Gulen and people of Hizmet, the movement emerged stronger. So those 6 years while he was on the run, he continued patiently to practice positive action, encouraging people to build schools, promote education, etc. And the movement emerged stronger throughout this persecution. Now, what has happened since 2012, because it actually predated the coup event in July 15th, 2016, because what has happened since then is unprecedented in scope. Truly human rights violations of the first order to which the entire world needs to mobilize and address. All right, but Mr. Gulen as is true of all practitioners of nonviolence, follows this first principle. Do not mirror evil. The first principle of nonviolence is do not mirror evil. But as Gandhi taught, practice satyagraha, truth force, truth power instead. And so here's how I wrap up the book, with your leave, the last few pages at least, although at this point you don't have much choice. Finding hope in the midst of trouble had been a regular, almost routine part of his biography. And by now there were islands of peace, as he called them, on every continent. Those peace islands were the schools, dialogue centers, and social enterprises wherever they operated. And those peace islands were countries where new friends could be made and where Muslims could practice their faith without oppression. For if an old man might be tempted during a cold winter in exile, he's been in exile in America since 1999, self-imposed exile. If an old man during a cold winter could despair of ever again seeing those green spring days, as he wrote in a poem while in exile, eyes on a very long horizon and tied to no specific nation, and here I am now quoting Mr. Gulen, our old world will experience an amazing springtime before its demise. This springtime will see the gap between rich and poor narrow. The world's riches will be distributed more justly according to work, capital, and needs. There will be no discrimination based on race, color, language, or worldview, and basic human rights and freedoms will be protected. Individuals will come to the fore, and learning how to realize their potential will ascend on the way to becoming the most elevated humans on the wings of love, knowledge, and belief. In this new springtime, Mr. Gulen continues, when scientific and technological progress has been taken into consideration, people will understand that the current level of science and technology resembles the stage of life when an infant is learning how to crawl. Humanity will organize trips into space as if they were merely traveling to another country. Travelers on the way to God, those devotees of love who have no time for hostility, will carry the inspirations within their spirits to other worlds. Yes, this springtime will rise on the foundations of love, compassion, mercy, dialogue, acceptance of others, mutual respect, justice, and rights. It will be a time in which humanity will discover its real essence. Goodness and kindness, righteousness and virtue will form the basic essence of the world. No matter what happens, the world will come to this path, sooner or later. Nobody can prevent this. We pray and beg that the infinitely compassionate one will not let our hopes and expectations come to nothing. So I conclude. In a winter of brutal strongmen, such hopes for a glorious spring seemed utopian, no better than a prayer. Yet if there was one thing that Fethullah Gulen really knows how to do, it was to pray. So when he also encouraged people that difficulties increase in accordance with the greatness of the consequent reward, that too was a prayer. But it was also a maxim that had been tested in Fethullah Gulen's life and proven true almost from its beginning. One more long paragraph. To some, the oppression in Turkey signaled the death of Gulen's dream for a golden generation, as he called it. And there was surely a death looming. The boy from Korajuk was now a frail, old man. And yet Fethullah Gulen's life was never about a short-term horizon to be measured by the brief span of 80 years and 10. He believed in heaven. He believes in resurrection. He believes in justice. These beliefs were not tied to the next news cycle, the next election cycle, or even to an individual life cycle. His horizon was eternal. And if the moral arc of the universe was long, and it seemed particularly long in the second decade of the 21st century, Gulen and people close to him also shared the belief of many people of faith that the moral arc of the universe did bend toward justice. They were also convinced that it was humanity's duty to help bend the moral arc of the universe in that direction. As Gulen put it often in many publications, power resides in truth. Any power otherwise founded was destined to fail. And so the end of Fethullah Gulen's earthly life, whenever it would happen, would hardly be the end of Hizmet. Eternal truth cannot be contained by an authoritarian's ambitions. Fethullah Gulen had lived for a peace that surpassed understanding, because it was a peace that surpassed the superficial limits of time and space. After all, even a Sufi in exile, whirled in a light far more substantial than mere earthly matter, caught up in an energy that was present at the very beginning of creation, and that would be there at the end of time. Thank you.
Thank you also, Mohammed, for your kind introduction, but it indicates that even someone with a PhD or near a PhD can sometimes make little mistakes in descriptions. I'd like also particularly to say I don't think I'm in a capacity to actually respond to Professor Pahl, Jon Pahl, because I don't have his learning. I haven't had the opportunity to read through the entire book. But what I would like to do is to pay tribute to, I see so many people in the audience who I can see, my colleagues from the Canberra Interfaith Forum, chairman and committee members and others here, that in an act of altruism I'm prepared to step aside if you would like to speak instead of me. It was a teaching of an ancient rabbi, Rav or Rava, who taught that every address or sermon or lecture should be started with humour, because psychologically it opens the mind to be receptive to messages. I'd like to confess from the start that I'm merely at the stage of what is called in Hebrew Reshit Chochmah, the beginning of wisdom. I'm starting to have an idea of how much I don't know and how much I still have to learn. I'm a seeker of truth, and I mention that because one of the lovely expressions of Maimonides, who is considered the greatest teacher in Judaism since Moses, who's known in the Islamic world as Abu Imran Musa ibn Maymun al-Qurtubi, and was the physician to Salahuddin in Egypt about 1,000 years ago, and a great scholar whose medical treatises, some of which are still used in universities today, on asthma, for example. And one of the things he has in the introduction to a Pentateuch, which was commonly printed throughout the United Kingdom, acknowledge the true from whatever source it come. It's a wonderful teaching. So let me point out in preface that Judaism does not claim for itself sole access to heaven. Now, if that isn't altruistic, I really don't know what is. There's a teaching about the unity of God, that and there's a teaching, the righteous of all nations have a share in the world to come and are heirs of immortality alongside the righteous in Israel. A later midrash from one of our books, and it's the cognate of the word madrasa, because the parables lead to learning, and I'm going to tell a few little stories. I call heaven and earth to witness that whether it be Jew or heathen, man or woman, freeman or bondman, only according to their acts does the divine spirit rest upon them. So I have to give a few pictures from my life and from some of the little books I have here, which will illustrate this topic of altruism in different ways. It's a difficult topic in a way, because there's a very ancient argument in Judaism from the time of Rabbi Akiva, You picture this, you're in the desert, because our origins as a people of the desert and an agricultural people. You're in the desert. There is water left enough for one person to survive. There are two of you. What should be done? Rabbi Akiva taught it is not sensible for both to die when one can live. But then the issue arises, how does one decide? This wasn't in agreement, by the way. You know, many of you have heard the expression, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. It's actually far worse than that. There was one of the mystic rabbis of the ancient city on the Galilee, Safed, taught that for each Jew there are 2,400,000 opinions. And the basis of that was that there were 600,000 Jews at Mount Sinai, and there are 4 levels of understanding, so 4 times 600,000 will give you the idea of the complexity. And I recall one head of Jewish studies in an Orthodox school. I visited his home, and the walls, if you can imagine books, all the length of walls like this and more, because as one of the authors I have talks about Judaism as the most booked out civilization in history. We start with words, at the beginning was the word. So if you want an argument, pick a Jew. And the argument goes on. I won't give you the answer here because of the teaching of Rabbi Hillel, who taught what is displeasing to you, do not do unto others. All the rest is literature, go and read. So I invite you to read up on that topic of Rabbi Akiva. Now, the issue is between altruism and the Golden Rule. Now, Hillel taught also a very important aphorism: if I am not for me, then who? And this is 2,000 years ago. But if I am only for me, what am I? And if not now, when? Now, this encompasses a number of things, and in fact, it's been explained that the instructions on airlines, you know, in case of emergency, given to mothers, relates to this teaching. The mother has to ensure that she has oxygen and support in order to save the child that she may be holding. So there has to be a certain egoism involved, or an egotistical aspect of survival first for oneself in order to save another. So the issue of altruism, as you can gather much more from what John has said to you, is much more complex. And I don't have the time or the knowledge to go into all the parameters. So there's another aspect which is important to consider. Many in Christianity, Islam and Judaism have heard of the Golden Rule. And the Golden Rule, which I quoted from Hillel, puts it in the negative. As I explained the reason, because you probably know the form, do unto others as you would have done unto you. The problem for me is that doesn't include the sadist who gains pleasure from pain. You see, so there's a particular philosophical intent and purpose in putting it in the negative, because interestingly enough, putting in the negative, as Rabbi Hillel did 2,000 years ago, actually helps put a more secure foundation for that. Now, that Golden Rule, however, is a kind of reciprocal altruism. So it's an altruism where one gets a reward from one's actions. But true altruism, of the kind we've heard from Fethullah Gulen, is one which does not seek reward. And from the perspective of Judaism, that is expressed in the teachings of love. And love, according to linguists, the etymology is actually, although English, of course, is described as an Indo-European language from the Indo-Iranian group, the Hebrew word for heart is lev. Think about it, lev, love. It's not just coincidental. Now, the commandments, love the neighbor, doesn't expect any reward in return. The divine command to love is an altruistic one. But it occurs once, if I'm correct, in the Hebrew texts. The command, love the stranger, according to the Talmud, occurs 36 times. There's a mysticism in that number, but I don't have time to go into the mystical aspects. But I'll explain from a statement, and the reason I mention Rabbi Herman Cohen, because Fethullah Gulen had an interest in Kantian philosophy.
Definitely.
Rabbi Herman Cohen of the 19th century was a German Jewish Reform rabbi and a neo-Kantian philosopher. And he has a wonderful little explanation of this law of loving the stranger. The rabbis explained that nothing should be done to annoy or injure the stranger, or even by word to offend their feelings. And he says the law of shielding the alien from all wrong is of vital significance in the history of religion. With it alone, true religion begins. And then he goes on to say, the alien was to be protected because he or she was a human being. And Rabbi Herman Cohen suggests in the alien, therefore, humans discovered the idea of humanity. So this love without expecting anything in return, is the divine expression of altruism. I just want to mention something here from Australia's history, the current history. I attended a session, an interview with the author who just last Friday was taken from Manus Island after 6 years, never having been convicted of any crime, never having been found guilty by any court, who was referred to only by his guards as ME45, never having been given the dignity of a name, who has won the New South Wales Premier's Award for Literature, the Victorian Premier's Award for Literature, and the National Biography Award, and for wanting freedom and democracy as a member of a minority, a Kurdi from Iran, a poet and a writer, has been imprisoned for 6 years and now released in Port Moresby, which is one of the most dangerous cities in the world, especially for some of the refugees. I don't have time to go into that, but if you do, one of the things I would suggest, please write to our politicians and ask for some humanity and love of stranger, since some of our politicians have expressed an adherence to faith, that faith as an idea without putting it into practice, as we heard, does not have significant meaning. And from the Jewish perspective, the word deed and commandment are the same. Beiruz Bushani and his book No Friend But the Mountain. So, compassion. My concluding lecture, in retirement I taught at Canberra Grammar. There were 180 students in a hall, and I asked them, what's the difference between passion and compassion? Isn't passion also an expression of love? But you see, one can have passion for inanimate objects. Some people are in love with their phones, some people are in love with cars, with diamonds, with handbags. One can have passion for all kinds of things. A passion for board games or, whatever. But compassion, one can only have for another living being. And I'll come back at the end in my concluding remarks to an email I received from a disciple of Fethullah Gulen, which will express that idea of compassion and which will explain why it's been an honour for me to participate in any of the events and functions which Bluestar Intercultural Centre, these wonderful followers of Fethullah Gulen, have put on in this city. So there's also a slight difference from Jewish perspective between altruism and charity. Now, it's not that one gives charity, although sometimes it is true that some people can give charity so they feel better about it. Maimonides, whom I mentioned earlier, wrote about 8 levels of charity, that the highest form was that which is the grant of a gift to enable a person to become independent, and you referred to that in the social aspect, the social economics of Fethullah Gulen and Yunus, Muhammad Yunus. So this is an ancient teaching. The second highest was charity given anonymously. And the very interesting thing which I want to mention here, because there are interesting aspects of language which I love, and the Hebrew word for charity is tzedakah. We're coming up to a period in the Jewish year where we had three things that we try to achieve, and that is charity, and it's best translated in a sense by that Latin word caritas, but not completely. Prayer, which you referred to and the importance of it, and repentance or return to the divine message. Now the Hebrew word tzedakah, on a concept line, the Semitic languages consist of three consonants without vowels. The different vowels which one supplies create slightly different words. They're all written right to left and therefore have no vowels. So there are words deriving from that. Tzedek, for example, is a righteous person, a saintly person. It also connotes justice. So there's a link between charity, justice, and holiness. The implication and concept is that whilst giving charity can be an altruistic act, it is an act of justice. It is an act of saintliness, because it helps to heal a suffering world. I wanted to mention a couple of remarkable acts of altruism. Just before I do, since we mentioned Sufi mysticism, I worked with a scholar who is currently in Canada as a professor of Jewish studies, Professor Stephen Brown, and he mentioned there are extremely strong links between Sufism and Hasidism. Jewish Sufi texts written in Arabic belong firmly to the tradition of Islamic Sufism. I'm talking about the period of the golden age of Jewish Spain, as Jews refer to it, when Muslims and Jews and Christians worked together in the interests of scholarship and knowledge, and display much more contact with Muslim mysticism, such as Ibn Arabi, than with other branches of Jewish mysticism. Now, a couple of little stories on finishing up. Don't worry too much. There's a lovely book which also talks about love. I went to the lecture presentation during this Canberra Writers' Festival. An island of Zakynthos, a beautiful island known as the Flower of the East, Zakynthos, World War II, Nazi occupation. The Nazi commander ordered the mayor, Lucas Carrère, to come to his office. The mayor summoned the bishop of the island with him, Bishop Chrysostomos. I mention that name in particular, and I just mention it, it's an important message as why. The Nazi commander said, I want the names of all the Jews on the island. There were 250. The bishop explained, the Jews on this island are all Greek citizens. If you want the names of the Jews on this island, we will give you the name of myself, the mayor, and the bishop standing before you. While they were doing that, the people on the island hid the 250 Jews in the mountains, etc., all over the place. Not one was taken by the Nazis. Now, a paradox. St. John of Chrysostom taught, and the historical reasons that, and it was repeated by the chap who did the Pittsburgh massacre, the Jews are the children of Satan. Yet here we have a bishop, Greek Orthodox, with the name from that saint who decides to rescue the human beings because he recognized the humanity in the face of those who did not believe as he did who may not have looked as he did, but who bore the mark of the Creator in them. There's another brief example of another town in Poland, where opposite the Gestapo headquarters, a convent of nuns hid a large number of Jewish children. And whenever there was a raid by the Nazi officers, the children knew to run to the infirmary and wrap bandages around their face as if they had mumps, which the soldiers did not want to catch, and they left them alone. It was quite a remarkable ruse. There was the final story, again I'm talking about altruism, when one's life is at stake, and the penalty for hiding these people was one's own life and that of one's family. What greater act of love can there be? And the final one from a town in France, a Protestant town which hid 5,000 Jews during World War II. The town was Chambon-sur-Lignon. And it took more than 50 years for a French president to recognize the heroism of these people and their altruistic act. And he went there and he said, they did this because of the motto of the French Republic: Liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, fraternity. But Pierre Sauvage, who made a film about this town because he was born there, The Triumph of the Spirit, pointed out, no. Under the motto of the French Republic, 27,000 Jewish children were collected by French police to the Velodrome in Paris and sent to Auschwitz to their death. What motivated these people was the words on their temple from the ancient Jewish texts, love one another, which had become part of Christianity. So this love has come back to divine love as expressed as the ultimate act of altruism. I'll finish, because I'm out of time, well over, with this email which I received from a disciple of Fethullah Gulen, Professor Pericli. He said, it was an honor to meet you in person at the Iftar dinner. Again, this is what, from the... Thank you so much for the inspiring conversation and sharing the Jewish perspective on love and humanity. And then he goes on to say about his own. Similarly, Fethullah Gulen also preaches love. And this is what I'm finishing with as a tribute to the teaching of Fethullah Gulen. Love is an elixir. A human lives with love, is made happy by love, and makes those around him or her happy with love. In the vocabulary of humanity, love is life, and we feel and sense each other with love. Compassion is the beginning of being. Without it, everything is chaos. Everything has come into existence through compassion, and by compassion, it continues to exist in harmony. Everything speaks of compassion and promises compassion. Because of this, the universe can be considered a symphony of compassion. All kinds of voices proclaim compassion, so that it is impossible not to be aware of it, and impossible not to feel the wide mercy encircling everything. If this is the words of a disciple of Gulen, Fethullah Gulen, it's an indication of the greatness of that teacher.
Hard task ahead of me, especially following these two speakers. If you'd like to just stand up and have a bit of a stretch.
What a good idea.
A bit of a break.
I'll just close these blinds.
Let's get started. So, first of all, as a lawyer, I'm required to say this. Whatever I say is not a reflection of my employer, and it's not a reflection of any organization. The opinions are my own. Secondly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And thirdly, I'd like to greet you with the Islamic greeting of Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be upon you. I like stories. I like biographies, and so reading this book was actually an absolute pleasure, and it was brilliantly written. So I'm going to try and take you, if I can, on a little journey on a story of altruism from an Islamic perspective. It's a hard task. Try to bear with me, and come along if you can. the issue of altruism is complex, just like Harry said. It's a very complex aspect. So we'll start off with the easy part, which is the definition that we all know, which is to give preference to someone's needs and welfare over your own. So that's the basic, Oxford Dictionary sort of definition. The Arabic for altruism is al-ittar. I must have butchered that right now. If there's any native Arab speakers that. But
say it again.
Al-ittar? Yeah. That's all right. Let's move. Okay, there we go. What he said, not what I said. But digging a bit deeper, to understand really what altruism is from an Islamic perspective, there's been scholars who've really grinded this out. And I'll try and just touch the surface on that. And we'll try and make that connection with what Professor Jon Pahl said and what Harry said and in the biography of Fethullah Gulen. A 13th century Turkish Sufi scholar and poet, Yunus Emre, that's where we'll start. He had a beautiful saying. It's a very simple saying. He says, "We love the created because of the creator." Have a bit of a think about that. We love the created because of the creator. And that's really the essence of what Professor Jon said, is to see others as God sees them. Now, if we're actually able to do that, what a beautiful world we'd live in. You wouldn't be able to walk past someone without giving them a hug. You wouldn't. Imagine seeing that person the way God sees them. And you wouldn't be able to not cry. This is where the essence of where Fethullah Gulen's crying comes from, the sobbing Hodja. But it's not alien to people of faith. Look at Jesus. He wept at the Garden of Gethsemane. Look at Prophet Jeremiah, the weeping prophet. These were people who truly understood this concept of altruism as seeing the created as the Creator sees them, to love the created because the Creator loves them, but also to suffer with the created. I mean, we live in a very difficult world right now, and the example Harry gave is, this is Australia, and there's children suffering within our borders. I worked for the Department of Juvenile Justice for a while, and I used to get calls from 16-year-old girls who say, "I slept on the park bench tonight, where can I sleep today?" And we didn't have a bed. We couldn't afford a bed. Anyways, moving on. The Prophet Muhammad said, "None of you truly believes until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself." And this is a common theme that we've heard in Christianity and Judaism and many other faiths. But with that saying, altruism instantly became a condition of faith in Islam. You cannot have faith if you cannot love for someone even over yourself. And if you cannot have faith, how do you please your Creator? So we're going I'm trying to take you slowly deeper and deeper into this one word, which is altruism, but really it's so complex. We have the physical expressions of altruism, which is zakat or sadaqah, which is very similar to the Hebrew term, which is charity, to give. But like Harry said, that's just a very small component of it. It really isn't the whole picture of altruism in Islam. Altruism is more than a description of a person or an action or a feeling. In Islam, altruism is actually a means. That's the closest thing to we can get. It's a means. It's a means to raise one's faith, because we saw that connection of having faith. It's a means of displaying love towards God. By loving the created, you are expressing your love for the Creator. It's a means of acquiring love from God. By doing these acts of altruism and by loving, you are getting love from God. It's kind of a three-way thing here. It's you and the other and the Creator. It's a means to become a better person. It's a means to remove traits of envy, selfishness, greed, and interestingly, but not surprisingly, hard-heartedness. And we're coming back to the concept of the sobbing scholar and the prophets of the scriptures that sob. We live in a society where it's interesting. I have a 2.5-year-old son, and he fell the other day, and he was crying. And I picked him up and I said, "Come on, big boys don't cry." And I had to stop myself and think, that's the society we live in, but that's not the tradition of the people of faith. People of faith cried for each other. They wept, but they didn't stop there like what Professor Pahl said. They acted on it. The tears, the grief, was the driving force to make the place a better world. So we shouldn't be ashamed of our tears, really. In Islam, tears, particularly amongst men, is not a sense of shame. What the shame is if you cry and then you don't do anything about it. So I'll give you a couple of stories. I'll try and bring out these stories because, like Harry said, faith without meaning is really not a significant meaning at all. If we're talking about altruism and we've talked about this definition and I tried to kind of pull it apart, let's look at some examples, and I'll try to start from the earliest examples from Islam, which is with what the Prophet Muhammad said. The Prophet Muhammad had a saying. He said, "If anyone amongst you dies and leaves behind a debt or a destitute child, an orphan, then call me. I will be his guardian and I will pay his debt." And this, he was referring to the entire community. So imagine the burden he was putting on himself just then. And just to make things clear, and he says, "And if any of you dies and leaves behind a wealth, then I have no part of it. It belongs to his heirs." There's a nice story that I like of a conversation that the Prophet had with one of his wives, Aisha. To try and put the context, they were living in a desert climate, and food and meat especially was not easy to come by. It was a luxury. And so one day, the Prophet's family was given a bag of meat from a slaughtered sheep. And the Prophet told Aisha, "Make sure you give this out in charity. Give it to the people that need it." And so he went away and he came back and he asked Aisha, "Did you give it out?" And Aisha said, "Yes, I gave everything out, and but we kept for ourselves the shoulder of the sheep." And the Prophet smiled at her and said, "No, Aisha. What you kept for yourself was the reward of all the other parts of the sheep that you gave out. The only thing you really lost was what you kept for yourself, the shoulder of the sheep." That kind of brings out this notion, which we tend to forget. We kind of think that if we give, we lose. And I'm not only talking about money here, I'm talking about time, I'm talking about sacrifice, and I'm even talking about the lives that the people that Harry Opperman referred to in protecting the Jewish people. They weren't losing something, they were gaining something for themselves. In this world and the next, personally, I think. I'll give another example of 3 companions of the Prophet after the Prophet's life. There was a battle, and they were mortally wounded, and they were lying in the battlefield. And it's interesting, you've probably heard when people are dying, I don't know if there's any doctors here, they crave water, they get very, very thirsty. It's a common theme that you hear. And so it was the case with these 3 people. They were crying out for water, and there was a person who was carrying water around and trying to help these dying soldiers. So he went to one of the soldiers, but that soldier heard one of his friends crying out for water, and he said, "No, give it to him first." So he took the jug and ran to the second person to give him water, and the second person said, "No, there's a third person over there crying for water. Make sure he's given water first." So this man then ran to the third person, but when he got to the third person, he passed away. So he turned around and ran back to the second person, but by that time he'd passed away. And likewise, when he got to the first person, he'd passed away as well. The last acts of these people was acts of altruism in their lives. It's not because they were raised differently, or it's not because it's a different culture and society and they didn't have mobile phones then too. It's because of the view of how they saw altruism, the view of how they saw loving one another. And this is what Fethullah Gulen tries to really bring out. There's a view that Hizmet is kind of a new concept. And there was a term they used to say, the Gulen movement. And Fethullah Gulen used to say, when I hear the term Gulen movement, it's worse to me than if I heard you curse my mother. It's not my movement. It's not even a new movement. All I'm reminding you is what the prophets before reminded you plenty of times, is to change your way of thinking about loving one another and serving one another. There's a verse in the Quran, 59:9, which says, and they give others preference over themselves, even though they themselves are in need. And it's in reference to when the Muslims from Mecca, they were being persecuted. So they left Mecca and they migrated to Medina. And the Muslims in Medina then took these refugees into their houses. Now these Muslims who were in Medina didn't have much. Mecca was an industrial city. The people in Mecca were fairly wealthy. The people in Medina, it was an agricultural city. They really didn't have much, but they gave everything. They took them into their houses. They fed them from what they had. There are stories of how the Muslims in Medina didn't have much, and so they saved food for their children. But when these Meccan refugees came, they took them into their houses, they fed their children water and turned the lights off, and then gave the food to the refugees. And the reason they turned the lights off is because they didn't want these Meccan Muslims to know that they were eating the last morsels of food. So they pretended to eat with their guests, so their guests didn't feel bad. Draw a comparison to today, where we do have refugees, and they're locked up. I know we're running out of time, so I'll try and wrap up very quickly. I'll say one last story. This story was told to me by a person that I met in Sri Lanka who was a student of Fethullah Gulen, and he went to one of these schools that John talked about. He went to one of these schools. So he was telling me about one of his friends. Now, I'll admit, I can't remember his name, but we'll call him Mehmet.
Okay.
Right. That's a good name? Yeah. Mohammed? Good Turkish name, Mehmet? All right, we'll go with Mehmet. Yeah, okay. Mehmet, I think, was at that time, he said, was around a 16, 17-year-old boy, and he was living in a dormitory. So he went to a school that was established, and they had these dormitories for children to stay and live in an atmosphere that they could develop themselves spiritually, but more importantly, through the natural sciences, because they had all the kids who would mentor them and tutor them spiritually, but also through natural sciences. And so they'd be given tutoring in maths and science and biology and stuff in these safe school homes that were connected to these schools. And this particular boy, Mehmet, he didn't like to study the natural sciences. He was one of those kids who wanted to be an entrepreneur, to make money fast. And so he stayed there for a while, and he felt that he wasn't getting what he wanted. He wanted to become a businessman. And so in the middle of the night, he packed up and he decided to go back home. And he told himself, I'm going to go back home, work somewhere, save up some money, become a businessman, develop my career, and get rich. So he's sneaking out of the corridors, and lo and behold, he meets Fethullah Gulen coming the other way. And he's with his bag. And Fethullah says, son, where are you going? And he says, well, I'm caught red-handed, so he says, I'm leaving. And he said, okay, what would you do when you leave? And he said, well, I'm going to go and I have some savings and I'm going to work and I'm going to increase that savings. And he said, and then what? And then he said, well, once I get that savings increase, I'm going to find a partner that will help me and we're going to start a business. And he said, and then what? And then he said, well, I'm going to do some marketing so that I can start, producing the things we need and we can sell it and it's going to go to all levels of society. And he said, and then what? And he said, well, I'll be rich. And Fethullah Gulen said, and then what? And he said, I'll be rich. And then Fethullah Gulen said, you've told me the story of what you will do for yourself. Where's the story of what you will do for someone else when you leave? And he said, that hit me like a ton of bricks. We forget that. It's a society we live in. And we're talking in the 1950s, 60s. It was the same society then as well, where we're so caught up with myself and my family and work, 9 to 5 jobs. we forget that we have all these created beings that are loved by the Creator that we claim to love around us. And we meet them on a daily basis. And we get opportunities on a daily basis to show the love to the Creator of the Creator we love, and to show the Creator we love the Creator loved. Yet we walk past it. And this was what Fethullah Gulen was telling this 16-year-old boy. You can take whatever path you want, but make sure that you do something for others, because life's too short to live for yourself. And he said, I took my bag and I went back to my dorm. He never became a businessman. He studied and became a teacher. Then he became a principal at one of the schools, which was set up in a developing country. He helped a lot of students who were from very poor backgrounds, and he never got rich. But he was happy, and he said, I found contentment in my life, because I knew that life was too short to live for myself. I'll stop there.